The wind rolled through the dust plains that morning, carrying with it the faint smell of dry earth and heartbreak. The sun had barely climbed over the horizon when she saw him for the last time, his boots pressing into the sand, his shadow stretching long beside the woman in the green dress. He didn't look back, not even once, and yet every few steps her heart whispered that he would. She stood there barefoot, her apron still damp from washing, her hands trembling against her mouth. She had no words left to call him by, no tears left to give. The silence between them had already buried more than words ever could. The man she'd once nursed through fever, fed when he was starving, and prayed for every night, was walking away with another woman. The woman's emerald dress gleamed in the morning, sun like it belonged to another world, a world where love was effortless and endings were written in comfort. But she had never known comfort, not on this hard, unyielding land where everything had to be earned: water, bread, and even the right to hope. They said life in the frontier was about survival, but she had learned that hearts had their own kind of hunger. He had been her only warmth in years of winters that bit through thin walls and lonelier nights when the coyotes howled louder than her prayers. She had believed in him, believed that he'd stay. But dreams don't hold men the way a promise of money or comfort can, he'd once told her. A man has to chase what'll keep him alive. She had smiled then, not realizing he meant someone else. That morning, she didn't chase after him. She just stood, her figure small against the vast open plains, while his horse stirred the dust and his laughter drifted faintly back to her. The wind carried it away before it reached her ears. Years passed like long shadows stretching across forgotten fields. The land grew rougher, and so did she. The cabin that had once been built with love became a place of quiet endurance. She kept it standing through storms and loneliness, patching the roof with her own hands, tending the fields that barely grew enough to feed her. Folks from town said she was proud, maybe too proud, but she never asked for help. Not when her hands cracked from cold, not when she fell sick, and the nights got so long she thought the silence might swallow her whole. Still, she never left that porch. That porch had been built by his hands. Every board, every nail carried his memory. She used to sit there after sundown, watching the horizon where he had vanished years ago. She told herself she wasn't waiting, just watching. But deep down, she knew better. Then, one autumn evening, when the air smelled of dry corn and smoke, a horse came down the same road again. It wasn't a proud gallop this time, just a slow, tired walk. The man who climbed down was older, worn, his hat drooping low over his eyes. His clothes were torn, his face shadowed with dust and regret. He stood by the fence for a long time before speaking. "Didn't think you'd still be here?" said his voice rough from years of shouting against wind and fate. She didn't move. The old rocker creaked beneath her as she looked at him. Time had carved him hollow. Whatever had driven him to leave had long burned out. There was no woman in a green dress now, no soft laughter following behind him. Only silence. "You came back," she said softly. It wasn't a question. He looked down at the ground, his boots sinking slightly in the dirt he once helped level. "I got nowhere else to go." The words hung heavy between them. She studied him in the fading light, his hands trembling slightly, his shoulders slumped with shame. She could have told him to leave, could have reminded him of the way he'd walked away without a word. But instead, she just said, "You're standing on your own land now. You built that fence, remember?" He nodded slowly. "I remember." She rose from her chair, her movements slow but steady. "You'll need water for your horse," she said, "and a blanket for the night." He looked up at her, his eyes glistening with something she couldn't name. "You'd let me stay?" She hesitated, her hand resting on the porch post. "You can sleep out here," she said quietly. "On the porch." He looked down again, then nodded. "That's fair." When the night fell, the air turned cold. She stayed by the window, watching the shape of him lying by the porch rail, wrapped in the old quilt she'd once made for him. The crickets sang low in the grass, and the sky stretched endlessly above, heavy with stars. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. But memories don't sleep easy. Each creak of the porch brought back the sound of that other woman's laugh, the gleam of her green dress, the moment he chose someone else. She tried to close her eyes, but her heart was restless. There was no hate left, only a quiet ache that refused to fade. By morning, she stepped outside with a cup of coffee in her hand. He was still there, sitting up, staring out toward the fields. His eyes followed the horizon, where the sun was breaking through the thin fog. "You look like a man who's seen too much," she said softly. He gave a weary smile. "Lost it all. Thought I was chasing happiness? Turns out I left it behind right here." She didn't reply. She just handed him the cup, their fingers brushing for a moment. It felt strange, familiar, and distant all at once. He took a sip, his voice low. "I'm sorry. For all of it." She looked out over the land. The fence still stood, the same one they'd built together so many years ago. "You can't fix the past," she said, "but you can sit quiet and watch the sunrise." So they sat, two old souls bound by years of pain and silence, watching the light. Return to the world he came, every day after that. Fixing the broken boards, tending the land, saying little. She didn't ask questions. Some wounds didn't need words. Little by little, the distance between them softened. One evening, as they watched the sky turn gold, he turned to her. "I never thought you'd forgive me," he said. She smiled faintly. "I never said I did. But I didn't stop caring either." He looked down, his throat tightening. "That's enough for me." The wind carried the scent of the fields of new life, quiet and real. The same land that had once witnessed heartbreak now held the promise of peace. And as the sun sank behind the hills, he reached out, his rough hand resting over hers. She didn't pull away this time. Some stories don't need to start over. They just find their way back home. That night, for the first time in years, she left the porch light burning just in case he ever lost his way again. And though the years had stolen much, they gave them one thing, Baka, quiet ending, not of fire and regret, but of peace. The kind only time and forgiveness can build. The frontier had taken everything from her once. But as the stars lit up above them, she finally understood. Sometimes love doesn't come when you ask for it. It comes when both hearts have learned how to stay. The days that followed his return carried the weight of unspoken things. He stayed quiet, fixing the fence posts, feeding the hens, mending the wagon wheels that had long sat broken under the shed. Each day began with the same soft sound of his boots on the porch and ended with him resting by the steps, looking out into the dying sun. She never told him to stay, but she never told him to leave either. There was something unfinished between them. Something that had lingered through the years like a whisper in the wind at night. When the oil lamp burned low and shadows moved against the cabin walls, she thought of the past she had tried to bury. Back then, the world felt younger. The small town down the valley had been alive with music on Saturday nights. The saloon lights burned bright, the women wore their finest, and men rode into town after a long week on the range. That was when he first came into her life, dusty, hungry, half broken from the road. He wasn't a man of many words, but his eyes carried stories she couldn't read. He'd worked for her father, mending fences and herding cattle through long days of heat and silence. She had watched him quietly from the porch back then too, wondering what he was running from. He always said the same thing when she asked why he never stayed anywhere long. Some men just don't belong to one place. Yet, for a while he did. They shared meals in the small kitchen, laughter that felt rare and fragile. The fields grew better that season, the rains kinder. Folks in town started calling them a pair, even though neither had spoken of marriage. It was understood in the quiet glances, the way he fixed her mother's roof without being asked, or how he'd bring her wildflowers when he came back from riding the ridge. But then she came, the woman in the green dress, a stranger from the city, visiting her relatives. With hands too soft for the land, and a voice that could make any man forget his past. The first time she rode into the valley, the men stopped what they were doing to watch. He was no exception. Something in his gaze changed after that. She remembered the night she saw them dancing at the town hall. The music was slow, the lights dim, and his hand rested at the small of the other woman's back like it belonged there. She had stood by the door, her heart heavy as thunder rolled outside. The storm that followed that night was the kind that washed away everything: fields, fences, and the life they had begun to build. He left not long after. No letter, no goodbye, just the echo of his boots fading down the dirt road. Word traveled fast in small towns. Folks said he'd gone east with the city woman, chasing dreams bigger than cattle and dust. She never asked anyone about him again. But in the quiet hours, when the wind howled through the cracks, she still heard him say her name. Years hardened her. She learned to fix everything that broke, from fence posts to her own heart. The townsfolk admired her grit, but whispered about her loneliness. Some said she was waiting for him. Others said she was too proud to remarry. None of them knew the truth, that she had once buried hope with her own hands and promised never to dig it up again. Now he was back. Older, worn, and humble in ways she had never seen before. The woman in green was gone, and he carried the kind of sorrow that didn't need explaining. But his return brought more than memories. It stirred the ghosts of what could have been. The town noticed too. Whispers began again when they saw him riding into town with her wagon to trade supplies. Some pitied him, others judged her for letting him stay. The shopkeeper once asked her quietly, "You really letting him back under your roof?" She had only smiled faintly and said, "Not under it. Just near enough to remember where he came from." Odd. But things were changing on the land. The river had started drying earlier each year, and the cattle weren't thriving like before. A new rancher had moved in across the ridge, a man with too much money and too little mercy. He'd been buying out small farms, one by one, pushing old families off their land. She knew it was only a matter of time before he came for hers. One evening, as the orange light slipped across the horizon, she found him standing by the fence, staring toward the ridge. "He offered you money yet?" he asked without turning. "Not yet," she said. "He will. He doesn't like people saying no." She crossed her arms, the wind lifting strands of her hair. "I've said no to worse." He nodded, a small smile flickering. "You always were stronger than most." She wanted to ask him where that strength of his had gone all those years ago, but she held her tongue. It wasn't anger that stopped her, it was the quiet sadness of knowing that some questions had no good answers. Later that night, she found him sitting by the porch fire, sharpening an old knife he must have carried all these years. His hands were steady now, but his eyes carried something else's fear, maybe guilt. He spoke softly without looking up. "You ever think how life circles back? You run far enough, and somehow you end up right where you started." She sat down across from him, the firelight dancing between them. "Maybe it's not the place that brings you back. Maybe it's the people you left behind." He looked up then, his gaze meeting hers. "I didn't think I'd be welcome." "You weren't," she said quietly. "But life's got a way of humbling a man." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with everything they hadn't said for years. The crackle of the fire was the only sound, steady and warm, like the heartbeat of the land itself. Over the next few days, she began to notice small things. He'd rise before dawn, fetch water from the well, repair what needed mending without being asked. He never crossed the porch threshold without her say. At night, he'd sit under the same stars they once watched together, saying nothing, as if words were too fragile for what lay between them. Still, something lingered in unease she couldn't shake. One afternoon, while sorting through the barn, she found a letter tucked inside his saddlebag. The paper was creased and faded, the ink nearly gone. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The words were written in a delicate hand. "You said you'd come back when you had something to offer. I'm still waiting. Don't let that land bury you." The name at the bottom wasn't hers. She folded it carefully, put it back where she found it, and walked out into the light. That night, she didn't bring him supper like she usually did. When he asked if something was wrong, she only said, "Some debts don't fade as quick as others." He looked at her for a long time, then nodded, as if he understood. "I didn't lie to you," he said quietly. "I just wasn't man enough to stay." She turned away, her voice low. And now, he stood there, the firelight outlining his weary face. "Now I'm trying to be..." The night stretched long after that. Neither spoke again. The wind howled across the plains, rattling the windows, carrying dust through the cracks. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, soft and uncertain. But even through the silence, something was shifting. Not forgiveness, not yet. But maybe the start of understanding, the kind that comes only after everything else has been burned away. The next morning, she found him by the field again, watching the sky. "Storm's coming," he said. She looked at him, the man who had broken her once and now stood ready to face whatever came. "Let it," she said. "This time I'm not running." As the first drops of rain began to fall on the dry earth, neither of them moved. The storm was coming, and with it, the reckoning they both knew they couldn't avoid. The storm that rolled in that night was not the kind that breaks a drought. It hung low and mean, throwing down quick spits of rain and long strips of lightning that showed every fence post and dry wash like a flash of memory. He stood out in it with a slicker over his shoulders, making sure the gate latches held. She watched from the porch with a lantern in her hand, the light trembling on the step. The wind felt like it could pry loose old secrets if it wanted. By morning the sky cleared, but the ground told the truth. The rain had been loud and little. Dust clung to the sage like stubborn grief. He came in from the far pasture with his hat pushed back and a look that said something had shifted on the other side of the ridge. "Riders," he said. "3 of them. Looking over the North Creek like they owned it." She set the coffee down and wiped her hands on her apron. "The new ranchers' men, or scouts," he said. They were measuring with their eyes. "That creek is your last good water." "Our last good water," she said, and the way the word settled between them had its own weather. He nodded once. "I'll ride up after I fix the hinge on the chicken pen. Don't want a fox getting bold while we're distracted." That was his way now. He spoke of small chores like they were stones you laid in a river to cross safely. She let him, 'cause the day ahead was wide, and she needed the steadying sound of a hammer and a gate swinging true. Word from town came through the milk driver that afternoon. The new rancher had filed a claim about the creek boundary, saying the map from years back was wrong. No one said it outright, but everyone understood. The bank and the law could be bent if a man leaned hard enough. She rode into town with a basket of eggs and her mind ironed flat. Every doorbell sounded sharper than it should. People looked up when she passed, then looked away. Old friends nodded and pretended not to count the days since he had returned. On the porch of the general store, she met the sheriff. He was decent, and he had known her folks. "You heard about the complaint?" he said, not asking. "There'll be a meeting at the courthouse Friday. Bring your deed. Bring anyone who knows those lines." She thought of her father's hands holding a rough survey string, wind tugging it, the two of them laughing when it broke. He had set the fence where the cottonwoods grew thickest, because trees know where water sleeps. "I'll bring what matters," she said. On the way home, she stopped by the churchyard. Her mother's stone was small and set deep, so the wind could not find it easy. She touched the name and spoke quietly. "I might need you again." The wind was gentle there. It always was. Back at the cabin, he had supper waiting. It was simple. The kind men cook when they have only a pan and a memory of being cared for. He did not say anything when he saw her face. He just pulled out a chair and poured water into her cup. "They will come by before Friday," he said. "Bullies like to knock before the door opens on its own." "Let them knock," she said. "If they break their knuckles, that's on them." I almost smiled. "You always did speak like the land, plain and strong." Later, while he checked the stock and she swept the floor, a boy rode up from town with a note. It was tidy and neat as a banker's pocket watch. The new rancher invited them to a friendly talk at his big house. The boy said the word friendly like it was heavier than the horse he was on. She folded the paper and sent the boy off with a biscuit. When she turned, he was watching her. "You going to go?" he asked. "Or make him come here to find out who you are?" She set the paper by the lamp. "I'll go. I need to see a man's eyes when he talks about kindness." He saddled up early the next morning. The ride over the ridge took them past old hunting trails and a stand of cottonwoods that had survived more summers than either of them. The big house sat in a new square of cut timbers and fresh paint, all straight lines and bright hope. Men stood by the porch with clean shirts and the empty look of fellows. Hired to hold a stare as a job, the rancher came out with his hands open. He looked like the kind of man who sold rail ties by the mile and thought grass and people grew back the same. He poured coffee that tasted like a compromise and asked them to sit. "I want to make this easy," he said. "My crews are bringing in a line from the east. There will be a spur station not far from here. We'll need the creek and grazing rights in that valley. I can offer a fair price for your parcel, and if you sign now, I'll throw in a small place near town and a stipend until the spring." She listened and let the wind talk through the tight map pinned to his wall. It ran the creek in a straight line. "Creeks don't run straight in this country. That map is a guess in a fancy suit," she said. "The creek bends around a bed of rock and doubles back on itself. The cottonwoods mark it true," he smiled like a man who hears a tune from a music box he thinks he owns. "Trees can be moved. Lines can be redrawn. I'm trying to avoid trouble." "Trouble skips breakfast here," she said. "But it never starves." The men by the porch stopped smiling. He stood up slow. "I admire grit," he said. "But I have contracts, and the bank is with me. The sheriff won't stop progress over a few stubborn board feet." "The sheriff knew my father," she said. "He knows what we built and where. He also knows the law is more than ink." "I have a lawyer," he said. "I have a deed," she answered, and let the weight of her voice tell him she also had weather on her side as they mounted up to leave. The rancher called out, "If the east flood hits and cuts that creek deeper on my side, it will settle this for us." She did not turn. "If the flood hits, you'll learn what the rest of us already know. Water owns men when it wants to." They rode home in a steady quiet. At the ridge, slowed his horse and watched the valley like a man measuring whether his back could carry it one more mile. "You spoke strong," said. "You kept your hands easy when those porchmen stared." "That helped," she replied. "I used to think leaving meant I was strong," he said. "Now I see staying steady is harder." At the barn they found a note pinned to the door with a nail too new for that wood. It was short. It warned that cattle had wandered near the ridge and could be claimed as stray under open-range custom if they crossed past a new set of posts. Driven in behind the north field, he pulled the note free and checked the pasture. Sure enough, the posts had been set to hands inside her fence. They spent the next hours moving the small herd, well south and checking for breaks. The sun did not seem to shift at all, just hung there like a held breath. By dark, the herd bedded down, and the coyotes started their sharp music. She stood by the fence and listened with him. It felt like the night was edging closer to the house than it had in years. A subplot found them the next morning. The schoolteacher from town came riding up with a basket and a worried look. She had taught new readers, both young and old, for seasons, and had the kind of kindness made folks tell her more than they meant to. She spoke in a low voice on the porch. "There is talk at the bank," she said. "They are calling in old loans on people who might stand with you Friday. A few are scared. They might not show." She thanked the teacher and gave her fresh eggs. When the teacher was gone, he rubbed his jaw. The rancher is not just drawing maps, he's drawing lines across people. Fear is a fence without posts. It still stops you. He looked toward the barn. "We need someone who knows the survey better than any banker." She thought of an old hand who had trapped beaver up by the headwaters and knew every bend in the creek like a hymn. He lived alone in a shack that leaned into a hill, and some folks called him touched by too many winters. She saddled up and went with him to find the man. The old hand opened the door with a cup in his fist. He studied their faces and laughed without joy. "I know why you're here," he said. "That new man wants to turn the river into a ledger. He'll learn it doesn't write straight." Led them to a chest and rolled out a worn map he had sketched with patience and stubbornness. It showed the creek braided and thin, then fat and slow under the cottonwoods. There were marks where floods had once cut new paths and marks where the water had always returned like it remembered. Home, he put a finger on a bend. "This is the place that matters. There is a spring under a flat rock up in the draw. Even in bad summers it seeps. You show that spring to a judge, and the creek line holds." She thanked him and reached into her bag for payment. He waved it away. I don't trust money that comes from men who speak of progress like it was a new kind of rain. You bring me a sack of coffee when this is done. That will keep me honest. On the ride back, clouds thickened again. The air felt different, like something was gathering more than weather. They reached the cabin just as a rider came in fast from the south. It was the sheriff. He swung down and moved up the steps without ceremony. 2 things, he said. A herd was pushed last night near your boundary. Tracks lead from the big outfit. We cannot prove intention, but you should keep your cattle penned. Second, there is a letter from a woman back east, forwarded through the hotel. It was addressed to his name, care of you. The sheriff handed over a sealed envelope. He watched their faces and tipped his hat. I will see you Friday. Bring that old map if you can. Then he rode off toward the ridge. He stood with the letter for a long breath. His hands were steady, but she saw the small muscle jump in his jaw. He opened it by the lamplight. The words were brief and careful. I am well. The city turned hard and promises turned thin. I hope you found what you needed where you first learned to hope. Do not come for me. There is nothing here worth returning to. He read it twice, then folded it and placed it back in the envelope. He did not look at her. She took the envelope and set it on the mantel. You kept something of her in your bag, she said. Now she has kept you honest in her way. He nodded once. I am here. I will stand here now. The next days moved like a slow fuse. He walked the fence at first light and again at dusk. She rode to neighbors and spoke plain. Some agreed to come Friday. Some looked down at their hands and said the bank had been at their door. She did not judge them. Hunger argues better than pride. At night he slept on the porch with his bedroll. She left extra wood tucked by the steps when the moon was thin. Words between them grew fewer, but each meant more. On Thursday, a boy from the general store came with a box. Inside was a rusted, small surveyor's chain, the kind her father had used. There was a faint note from an old friend. Thought you might need this? Folks forget that a straight line knows nothing about roots. They took the chain up to the spring the old trapper had marked. It was there, a shy shimmer under a flat stone, cool as forgiveness. He knelt and cupped water in his hands and for a moment looked young again. They marked the line with stakes and wrapped cloth around each, so the wind would not erase their thinking. When they rode back toward the cabin, smoke lifted thin over the ridge. He stopped. That is near the north field. He pushed the horses hard. The smoke turned thicker. At the edge of the pasture they found a small fire eating through dry grass, set in a neat curve, as if someone had walked and dropped flames step by step. He leaped down and beat at it with a wet sack, while she hauled water from the trough. The fire hissed and fought, and gave up all at once like a mean thought that cannot stand the light. They stood side by side covered in ash. He pointed to boot prints at the edge of the burn. Not theirs. Not the sheriff's. Fresh and deliberate. They want you tired before tomorrow, he said. They will not get what they want, she said. Night came with a deep quiet. Stars burned hard and close. She made a simple stew, and they ate on the steps. The silence between them had softened into something that was not forgiveness yet, but it knew the way. Just before midnight, a small sound reached the porch. Metal against wood. He rose and moved to the barn with slow steps, a hand on the old knife he carried not to use but to know he could. She followed with the lantern covered in her palm. In the doorway of the barn stood a figure in a coat too nice for night work. He held a wire cutter and a folded sheet of paper. He did not flinch at the light. I came to deliver a message, he said. My employer wishes you to reconsider tomorrow. The bank can be kind to friends and cruel to those who make the day long. She lifted the lantern higher. Tell your employer I bring a map older than his kind of kindness. The man let his eyes slide over the stalls and the careful order of the barn. You keep things tidy for a place that will be empty soon. He stepped forward as if to hand the paper, and in that moment he glanced at the rope on the far stall where the saddle sat. It was small, a telling, but she saw it. He had come to cut more than conversation if the chance opened. He backed away, perhaps sensing that they had felt his thought. You will find that men who plan rail lines also plan outcomes, he said softly. Do not be late to the courthouse. The wire cutters gleamed once in the lantern light, then vanished into his coat. He walked off without a look behind him. They stood there, listening to the steps fade into the dark, their hearts beating steady and slow like hooves in deep sand. The next morning brought a sky as bright as hammered tin. She cleaned the deed and folded the old survey map inside the cover of a family Bible because some things walk safer with a prayer near them. He saddled the wagon and checked each trace. The schoolteacher rode up with 2 townsmen who nodded and would not meet her eyes, but their presence was answer enough. The old trapper came on a mule that looked like a stubborn memory, the rolled map tied behind his saddle. As they started for town, a small wind rose across the valley, bending the grass and sending dust like a warning ahead of them. At the bottom of the hill, by the first gate, 3 riders waited. Their horses shifted and snorted. The men moved aside to let the wagon pass, but one leaned down and spoke through his teeth. Last chance to make this easy. She held the reins firm. Easy is a word men use before they take something. He smiled without warmth and tapped his hat. They rode on in a slow arc to fall in behind as if they were a friendly escort. He looked back once, then forward again. The courthouse stood square and pale in the bright. Townfolk had gathered in a loose ring that opened when the wagon rolled in. The sheriff stood by the door with a face that hid his thoughts. The banker rested his hands on a polished cane that had never known hard ground. The new rancher came down the steps with a look that measured, found everything already counted. She stepped down from the wagon with the Bible and the old chain. He came to her side without needing to be asked. The old trapper tied his mule and pulled the map from the roll. With quiet care, the bell in the church across the street struck the hour. The sound landed like judgment. She drew a breath and took the first step toward the door. Knowing the creek ran under this whole place whether any map showed it or not, inside the courthouse, the air felt cooler and still. The judge lifted his pen. Papers lay arranged in strict stacks. Outside, the wind shifted. The riders at the gate turned their horses as if they had received a signal. Somewhere beyond the ridge, thunder tried its voice again. She met the judge's eye and set the Bible on the table, her fingers resting on the cover. He placed the old chain beside it so the links touched the leather. She did not turn to see if the new rancher smiled. She did not need to. She could feel a smile like that, the way you feel a snake under a board. State your claim, the judge said. She opened her mouth, steady and sure. While under the floor of that careful room, the hidden spring she had marked in the draw went on seeping its cool truth into the earth. The courthouse held its breath. The judge leaned forward, and the room felt smaller than it was. Every sound echoed: the scratch of a pen, the creak of a boot, even the slow flutter of the flag outside the window. She stood at the center of it all, her dress brushed with dust from the ride, her hands steady on the Bible that carried the deed inside. He stood beside her, hat in hand, the lines on his face drawn deep from both sun and regret. The rancher's lawyer began reading aloud, his voice sharp and smooth, like a saw cutting wood too fast. He spoke of maps, boundaries, and rights, written in black ink. But ink had never known the land. The earth had its own way of keeping truth. When it was her turn, she unfolded the old map. The edges were frayed, the markings faint, but every bend of the creek was drawn from a lifetime of walking it. The judge studied it through his glasses, then looked up. This hand-drawn survey, when was it made? Before the bank built its first office, she said. Before any of these new maps were printed by men who've never felt mud under their boots. The lawyer laughed lightly, but it sounded nervous. Hand-drawn sketches hold little weight in court, Your Honor. Property lines must follow documented surveys, not family stories. Her voice didn't rise, but the words carried through the quiet. Stories are what kept this valley alive when the banks turned their backs. This land isn't a rumor, it's been lived on, worked on, bled on. The judge raised a hand. That may be so, but evidence must be proven. She nodded and stepped aside. The old trapper walked forward with his rolled map and set it beside hers. I marked this land 50 years ago, he said. Back when the cottonwood stood taller than any courthouse, that spring under the draw is older than all of us. The water runs from her side, and it's the only reason this creek still breathes in summer. The judge took his time comparing the papers. The lawyer shifted in his seat. Outside, thunder grumbled again, closer this time. The air smelled faintly of rain, but no drops had fallen yet. The rancher crossed his arms, staring at her like a man who already believed the ending belonged to him. The sheriff cleared his throat. "There's something else, Judge," he said. "We found evidence of tampering fence posts, moved near the north field, and fire marks by the ridge." The rancher's lawyer cut in. "Accidents. Dry brush catches easy this time of year."
"Not when the fire walks in a straight line," the sheriff said.
"And not when boot prints match those of men on your payroll." The judge's brow furrowed. "That will be investigated separately. Let's stay on the matter of ownership." She felt the tension knotting in her chest. Every second stretched like a wire pulled too tight. She looked toward him, her once lover. Now her silent defender Anne saw in his eyes the same battle, as she was fighting, regret, hope, fear. He wasn't just standing with her for the land. He was standing for what they'd both lost when he left. The lawyer pressed forward. "Even if this older map holds, the law cannot recognize undocumented surveys over certified property deeds." She could almost feel the ground shift beneath her. But before she could speak, he stepped forward. His voice was calm, low, but carried the kind of honesty that could not be rehearsed. "You talk of certified papers like they're the truth itself. But truth is what you can stand on without sinking. I built that fence with her father. I set those posts by hand. And when the rain comes, that creek runs through her land because that's where the water always has. I've seen it with my own eyes." The judge looked between them, silent. The room had gone still. The rancher finally spoke, his tone measured, his pride unshaken. "I respect hard work, but memory fades, and sentiment clouds judgment. We all want what's fair, but fairness follows law, not feeling." Her hands tightened on the Bible. "And what about the law that keeps a man honest?" she asked. "The law that says you can't burn what you can't buy?" The rancher smiled faintly. "Careful, miss. You're making accusations you can't prove." The trapper leaned forward, his old eyes bright. "Proof's waiting under that flat stone by the draw. The spring still runs clear if you've got the stomach to walk that far." A murmur spread through the room. The judge looked toward the sheriff. "Can you verify that claim?" "I can," the sheriff said. "If the court permits, we'll ride out after this session." The rancher's lawyer started to protest, but the judge silenced him. "Enough. The hearing will pause until verification is complete." She exhaled, the tightness in her chest loosening just a little. Outside, rain finally began to fall slow, heavy drops that darkened the dust and filled the air with the scent of wet earth. But the tension didn't break. The storm was only beginning. They left the courthouse under the watch of the crowd. Some nodded in quiet support, others turned away. The rancher and his men mounted their horses and rode ahead, the mud splashing under their hooves. The sheriff gathered a small group for the ride to the spring. She climbed onto the wagon seat beside him. The man who had once left her rode close behind, his face shadowed by his hat. His jaw set like stone. The road to the draw wound through low hills and dead grass. The rain grew heavier, soaking through coats and hats, blurring the line between sky and land. Thunder cracked above them, but no one turned back. The sheriff led the way, the trapper following with quiet certainty. When they reached the draw, the air was thick and the ground slick. The cottonwoods stood like sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind. The trapper dismounted and walked ahead, his steps slow but sure. He knelt by a flat stone half covered in moss and pried it up with his knife. Clear water shimmered beneath it, running cold and steady even in the storm. "There," he said, "the spring. The start of her creek." The sheriff knelt beside him and nodded. "That's proof enough for me." But the rancher's lawyer wasn't finished. He stepped down from his horse, his boots sinking into the mud. "A spring can shift in 50 years, he said. "There's no telling it hasn't moved." "Water doesn't lie," the trapper muttered. The rancher approached then, his coat plastered to his back, his voice calm but edged with anger. You think this changes anything? The bank still holds my paper. The courts bend for progress, and progress doesn't care where the water begins. She met his stare, her face cold as the rain. Then progress can drown with it. The wind howled through the trees. For a moment, lightning lit all their faces, the sheriff's grim, the trapper's determined, hers fierce and unyielding, and his, the man beside her, torn between guilt and defiance. The rancher turned to his men. We're done here. Mount up. But before they could move, the sheriff stepped in front of them. Not yet, he said. There's still the matter of that fire by her ridge. I found boot prints, same as yours. I'll need to ask a few questions when we get back to town. The rancher's jaw tightened. You're overstepping. You're trespassing, the sheriff said. The tension broke like thunder. One of the rancher's men reached for something under his coat. In that instant, the man beside her moved faster than anyone expected, grabbing the gun arm before it could rise. The two struggled in the mud, the sound of boots sliding and rain pounding around them. She shouted his name, but he didn't look up. The sheriff drew his revolver. Enough, he barked. Drop it. The man froze, then let the weapon fall. The storm swallowed the silence that followed. The rancher stared at her through the rain. You don't know what you've started, he said. Men like me don't lose. Maybe not, she said. But sometimes the land chooses who stays. They rode back in silence. The rain eased, but the air stayed thick, heavy with what was coming. At the courthouse, the crowd had doubled. Word of the fight had already spread. The judge was waiting. When the sheriff spoke, his voice carried over the murmur. The spring was found. The boundary holds. And there was interference on her land. I'll file charges when this hearing's done. The rancher's face went pale under his hat. He tried to speak, but the judge raised his hand. Enough for today. We reconvene tomorrow at sunrise. The court will hear final statements then. As the people filed out, she turned to him, the man who had once broken her heart and now stood covered in rain and mud because he'd chosen to stay this time. His eyes met hers, soft and tired. You all right? He asked. She nodded, but her voice was quiet. It's not over yet. He looked toward the window, where the last of the rain slid down the glass. No, he said, but tomorrow, something's going to give. Either the land or the men who try to own it. Outside, thunder rolled once more in the distance, low and steady like the beating of something old and unstoppable. The storm was moving east, but its shadow stayed behind, hanging over the valley, over the land, over to souls who had waited too long for peace. The morning of the final hearing came calm and still, the kind of quiet that feels heavy before something big. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the earth dark and damp, the smell of rain clinging to the air. She woke early, brushed the dust from her skirt, and tied her hair back the same way her mother used to before riding into town. When she stepped outside, he was already waiting by the wagon, hat low, eyes steady. The look between them said enough. Neither spoke of fear, but both felt it. The road to town seemed longer than usual. Every bend carried the memory of what they'd fought for, the fire, the lies, the years of silence that had stretched between them. The valley below shimmered faintly with puddles of rain, and the cottonwoods along the creek bent with the morning wind, as if bowing in quiet witness. When they reached the courthouse, people had already gathered. Word had spread farther than they expected. Some had come to see justice done, others to see how power would tilt. The rancher stood near the steps, his coat clean again, his eyes sharp. He gave a small nod when he saw her, the kind of nod that says, let's end this. Inside, the judge sat waiting, the sheriff by his side, the old trapper in the front row with his hat in his lap. The air was thick with silence. When she walked to the table, her boots left faint prints on the wooden floor, marks that might fade by noon, but carried the weight of years. The judge began without ceremony. Yesterday, we paused to verify boundaries and water rights. The evidence presented has been reviewed. Before I give my ruling, both parties may speak one last time. The rancher's lawyer stood first. His words came smooth as buttered paper. He spoke of order, of progress, of law as the backbone of civilization. He talked about the railroad, about new jobs and new opportunities. His voice was calm, confident, practiced. Every sentence sounded like it had been written long before the hearing even began. Then it was her turn. She rose, her hand resting lightly on the table. "This land isn't about law or progress," she said. "It's about belonging. My family came here when there was nothing but wind and hard ground. My father broke this soil with his bare hands. We didn't have maps or fancy paper to prove our right to stay. We had sweat, faith, and the strength to keep standing when others gave up. If that isn't ownership, I don't know what is." Her words filled the room, not loud, but sure. She turned to the judge, her voice softening. "You can draw a line wherever you please, but the land will always remember who loved it first. The creek runs where it wants, and so does truth. I just want to keep the piece of it that remembers us." When she sat down, the room stayed quiet. Even the rancher's men shifted uneasily. The judge looked at her, then at the map, then back again. He adjusted his glasses and said, "This court recognizes that the land may not follow the neatness of men's designs. The spring and the natural flow of the creek determine the rightful boundary. Therefore, the deed stands as valid under the original claim." A slow murmur rose through the room. The lawyer's face paled, the rancher stiffened.
"Oh."
And the trapper grinned faintly, like a man watching the sun come up after a long night. The judge's gavel struck once. Case closed. She didn't cheer. She just let the breath she'd been holding for years slip free. He looked at her, his eyes wet with pride and relief. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, painting the muddy street in gold. People nodded to her as she passed, quiet nods of respect, the kind that mean more than applause. The rancher approached her at the steps. His voice was calm, tired. "You won today," he said. "I didn't win," she replied. "The land did." He gave a tight smile and tipped his hat. "Maybe it's better this way. Some things can't be bought." Then he turned and walked away, his boots sinking in the soft ground, leaving deep tracks that rain would soon erase. The sheriff shook her hand before mounting his horse. "You held your ground better than any man I've known," he said. "Maybe because I had to," she answered. "The land doesn't protect cowards." The crowd thinned. It was just her and him standing by the wagon. The wind had softened, and the fields stretched wide and endless ahead of them. He reached for her hand, rough and scarred from years of work. And she didn't pull away. "You were right to fight," he said quietly. "I just wish I'd been strong enough to stand with you the first time." "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." They rode home slow, the horses tired but steady. The sun followed them all the way, lighting the land that had nearly been taken from them. When they reached the cabin, everything looked different, familiar, yet new, as if the earth itself had exhaled. The fence stood straight again, the grass shimmered from the rain. And the porch, once a place of waiting, now felt alive. That evening, she made coffee while he repaired the lantern. They didn't talk much. Words seemed too small for everything they'd come through. When the stars rose, she stepped outside and stood on the porch where she'd once watched him leave. Now he stood beside her, not behind, not ahead, just beside. He looked out at the horizon. "I kept thinking about all the years I wasted," he said, "chasing something that didn't last. I thought love was easy, like a trail you could just ride till it ended. I didn't understand that real love is work, the kind that keeps a roof up, keeps a fence standing, keeps a heart from turning cold." "Out," she smiled faintly. "You learned it the hard way." "I did," he said. "But I'm grateful I learned it from the one who never stopped believing I could." The night was quiet, except for the wind brushing the grass and the soft sound of the porch boards under their feet. She reached for his hand, and for the first time he didn't look away. Days turned into weeks. The creek flowed steady. The cattle thrived again. Neighbors began visiting more often, bringing stories and laughter that hadn't been heard in the valley for years. The land healed in small ways, new grass sprouting where the fire had burned, wildflowers blooming near the spring. And as the land healed, so did they. Sometimes, when the work was done and the sun was low, he'd sit on the porch steps with his guitar, strumming old songs he'd learned on the trail. She'd hum along while mending clothes or shelling beans, her voice blending softly with his. There was peace in those moments, the kind you don't chase, only find when you've earned it. One evening, he looked up from the strings and said, "I used to dream about running. Now I only dream about staying." She met his eyes and smiled. "Then stay." He nodded, and that was enough. Years later, when travelers passed through the valley, they'd talk about the woman who stood her ground and the man who came back to make things right. Some said the spring by the draw never dried again after that year. Others said the two of them built more than a home. They built a reminder that love, like the land, is strongest when you fight for it. As the seasons turned, the porch light still burned every night, glowing softly across the field. And though the wind carried away many things, old fences, worn trails, forgotten names, it never took the sound of laughter from that little cabin by the creek. The land kept them both, just as she'd always believed it would. And in the quiet between dusk and dawn, when the stars shimmered over the valley, the house seemed to breathe with life again, a promise kept, a love reclaimed, and a home that would never be empty again.